Having now seen the press night performance of this show, I can unfortunately share with you that my suspicions were correct. This is not quite Rebecca the musical, it's more like Becky, with the wood stairs. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my Stagey YouTube channel. My name is MickeyJo and I'm obsessed with all things theatre. I am a professional theatre critic and this is my theatre-themed YouTube channel where I review the shows that I have been invited to go and see. Today we're going to be talking all about the long-awaited, I can scarcely believe it, English language premiere of the cult musical Rebecca. I say cult musical, this has been a huge success in various European countries and internationally, but it has this crazy past where it hasn't been able to be produced fully on Broadway or in the West End, despite attempts, well-documented attempts. Now, I'm not going to begin to recount the full story of this show's saga when it comes to English language productions beyond my own experience, which is just over 10 years ago, I was planning to book tickets to go and see it at the Shaftesbury Theatre, where it was planning to open in the West End. This was right when I was starting to really get into theatre. That production sadly got cancelled because as they were digging into the theatre so they could put in the giant revolving staircase, they discovered an ancient underground stream and decided that it wouldn't be possible to go ahead with the production. They turned their attention to Broadway, and if you don't know what happened next, you can go and check out my friend Brendan's documentary over on Wait in the Wings here on YouTube if you haven't already. You probably have. If you haven't, please go watch it because it's mind-blowing what happened to this show. And after that, although the show thankfully has been a success elsewhere and is currently enjoying this major successful revival in Vienna, no one really anticipated an English language production ever resurfacing. That is until it was announced that the Charing Cross Theatre would present the world premiere of that version. And that opened earlier this week. That's what we're going to be talking about today. So, does this show live up to its saga? What is the English translation like? How are these performances? And what did I think of this decidedly smaller production of the show? Stay tuned to find out. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. I share many reviews, stagey challenges, theatre news, and plenty of other exciting content. If that sounds like something that you would enjoy, make sure you're subscribed. And if you're curious about this production of Rebecca at the Charing Cross Theatre, you want to know a little bit more about it, you can head over to my fiancé Erin James's YouTube channel, where he recently shared a vlog all about our experience of going to see the first preview. You can see what the theatre looks like, a little selection of the merchandise on offer that I'm wearing right now, Rebecca, as well as the euphoric audience response to the first preview curtain call. Now, right before I share with you my review of the opening night performance, here is a clip of that performance's curtain call.
It's my honour and privilege to welcome to the stage the creators of this very, very special show, Sylvester Levay, Michael Kunze and Sir Christopher Hampton.
So let's talk a little bit about Rebecca. There are going to be plenty of spoilers within this. This is based on a Daphne du Maurier novel that was famously adapted for film by Alfred Hitchcock. There have been subsequent film adaptations. It's been spoofed and parodied. I first learned the story of this bafflingly in like a comedy parody sketch on the Mitchell and Webb show, I believe. But it is laden with mysterious twists and turns, many of which I will be talking about in today's video. So if you don't know the story and you don't want spoilers, go see the show first and then come back to me when you're ready. But it concerns the character of Ich, in the original German version, which is German for I. She doesn't have a name because the novel is told from her perspective. I believe it opens with Last Night I Dreamt of Mandalay, which is Mandalay, the great manor where she comes to live with her new husband, Maxim de Winter, who she meets while the two of them are both holidaying separately in Monte Carlo. She is poor and shy and meek and unassuming, but she is being trained to be a companion by an obnoxious wealthy woman called Mrs. Van Hopper. But it's her self-effacing politeness that gets her noticed by Maxim, and the two of them fall rapidly in love and get married and go back to his ancestral home, Mandalay in Cornwall. When they arrive, they are greeted by the entire reasonably passive-aggressive staff, including the housekeeper, Mrs. Danvers. If you couldn't already tell from the production imagery, she's a little bit unhinged. Mrs. Danvers was a long-serving staff member and close confidant of the first Mrs. De Winter, Maxim's late wife, Rebecca. We never meet her, much like Jacob Marley in A Christmas Carol. She's dead to begin with. But the mysterious details surrounding her death and Mrs. Danvers' inability to just let it go is where we get a plot from. Mix in our protagonist's utter insecurities and a handful of really unnecessary supporting characters, and you have Rebecca. So if you're wondering what this is like as a musical, its most notable feature is its epic score. Although it premiered in 2006, it harkens back to the days of Phantom of the Opera and Les Miserables. It has that kind of a sound. Much like those other shows, its emotional scope is near operatic. It's dark and melodramatic and declarative, and it's at its best when the characters lean all the way into the melodrama, and when the material leans all the way into the melodrama. There's not a tremendous amount of subtlety or nuance in this show. The characters tend to just come out and sing what they're feeling. In the English translation, they sing it in pretty obvious terms. There are two real highlights among this material. The first is whenever Mrs. Danvers is confronting I and sort of maddeningly singing about Rebecca. The other is I's transformation over the course of the show, where confronted with all of these challenges, she doesn't buckle, but instead she finds a spine and she becomes this self-assured and confident young woman who is going to help her husband get out of the mess that he finds himself in. The novel itself presents the adaptation some challenges. The two of them have to fall in love very quickly after meeting, which it's hard to do convincingly, but it's not like we haven't seen this in a bunch of other musicals as well. Something that could be considered a shortcoming of the adaptation is, in the novel, like I told you, this is told from a first-person perspective, and there's a lot of mystery around the characters of Maxim and Mrs. Danvers, because she's this worried, nervous protagonist thinking, does he really love me? He seems distant. Is he still in love with his first wife, Rebecca? What's going on in his head? The problem is, in the musical, we don't have that mystery because he comes out and sings his feelings. It's not until the second act that we find out about his relationship to his first wife, but we know that he has a genuine feeling for her because he sings it almost immediately. Similarly, Mrs. Danvers could be this enigmatic, mysterious character. I think probably we oughtn't learn until later in the first act what really motivates her, but she sings the song She's Invincible almost immediately upon arriving in the show. That is immediately this creepy, villainy song. You know exactly who she's going to be. It makes her one note from the off because she doesn't really change throughout the show. She just remains obsessive about Rebecca and intense throughout. And so there's no question mark around her allegiance and trying to deduce her motivations. So when she tells I, for example, this would be a great dress for you to wear to the costume party you want to have, we as an audience know that this is terrible advice she absolutely shouldn't be taking. Admittedly, I is not present when Mrs. Danvers sings She's Invincible, but I think there would be some benefit in keeping a few more things secret from the audience until the right time for those details to emerge. I like the song She's Invincible. I actually think it could be utilised at a different point within the show because it would be a nice juxtaposition to the shock that Mrs. Danvers experiences when she finds out that Rebecca was secretly mortally ill and didn't share that with her. She's invincible versus, oh, she was very close to death. That's fun. Not for Rebecca, that is, but for the audience. As with many of these European shows, and it's worth saying that UK and European audiences seem to have a slightly different sensibility, much like American and English audiences do. There is also this slightly camp element that creeps in just occasionally. You can see this in a few really successful European shows. One example of this slightly camp sensibility is when Mrs. Danvers opens the windows in Rebecca's bedroom and says to I, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear her name on the wind. And rather than it being this sort of just like subtle sense of it, the wind is quite loudly saying, Rebecca. And perhaps I'm overthinking this, perhaps this isn't an issue for other people, but it does just tickle me, because the idea of them sort of listening faintly out on the wind, and the wind like so clearly enunciating this, like the wind went to RADA and is going to make sure every syllable of this name is hitting the back row of that theatre, because the wind only has 2 lines in this musical. The wind has trained for this moment and they are going to make sure it lands. Rebecca. But it leaves us in a slightly precarious position when it comes to the tone, and there are a couple of genuine head-scratching moments. In the second act, when I finally confronts Mrs. Danvers about her allegiance still being to Rebecca, and Mrs. Danvers reprises the song Rebecca, which is a great song, FYI. There's a moment where Danvers is taking Rebecca's old black satin robe from off the bed and putting it on I as she's singing to her and brushing her hair with Rebecca's old hairbrush, while she's basically singing "Don't you dare ever touch her stuff or she's going to haunt you." That sends a mixed message, but you can write all that off with just acknowledging that Mrs. Danvers is not quite all there. No, the moment I have a real issue with is after Maxim de Winter shares this revelation that he never loved Rebecca, and in fact he inadvertently, accidentally murdered her by pushing her to the ground moments after she revealed that she was pregnant via an adulterous relationship with her first cousin. A grossness that never really gets explored. I think it was different times. But in response to this, our protagonist of who should acknowledge this for the red flag that it is, basically goes, "Oh, thank God, I thought you were still in love with her. Now that I know that you just accidentally killed her because you found out she was pregnant with some other man's child, now it's fine." She literally sings this whole song where she doesn't come out and say, you know, thank God he just hid her body by sinking it in a boat after committing homicide during what he thought were the early stages of pregnancy. Thank God it's only that, and not lingering feelings for his first wife who was recently dead. That would be unthinkable. Phew. I just find it very hard to root for this moment because everything in my head is saying this is a red flag. You need to get out of the house. Needs to get out of the house. In terms of the composition of the characters, we meet an awful lot of men whose names we learn, considering that our protagonist, you know, is never afforded a name, and I get that that's how the novel is written and she doesn't have one. There are so many other characters who get names during the show who are men that just don't matter. Like, there's a guy called Mr. Crawley, and functionally he does absolutely nothing in this plot. He only exists to sing one song to I, where he's like, it doesn't matter that you will never live up to the beauty of his first wife. It doesn't matter that you're comparatively ugly and plain looking because you're a nice person. We learn the names of multiple male servants who I don't think do anything. We get told the names of multiple different members of like the police and legal professionals during the end portion of the second act. Oh, and then there's Giles as well. Why do we need to meet Giles? Giles is Maxim de Winter's brother-in-law because we meet Maxim's sister. She actually has a lot to do and she forms a close bond with I, and she has some decent songs. But Giles, her husband, is utterly superfluous to the plot, other than participating in a duet with her where they're like, we need to teach you how to live in the country and be posh because you're from Yorkshire and you don't know things. They want to give her a gun. She says she likes books. They turn into the townspeople from Beauty and the Beast and act like this is a ridiculous concept. But I like an awful lot of the songs, and I think a lot of people are struck by the strength of this score and the power of this score. I like the melodies, I like the refrains, they are lingering with me. That song, Rebecca, will haunt you, just like she will. My issue with the score is the orchestrations. And this is where we go back to that slightly camp quality that sort of undermines the seriousness of its gothic themes. Because in the first song, when she's singing Last Night I Dreamt of Mandalay, and in the second song, when Mrs. Van Hopper is singing You Will Never Be a Lady, they have this thing in common that recurs a couple of times throughout the show, where they have this soft rock percussive beat underneath, and it takes it from ballad to power ballad. If you're wondering what the difference is between the two, if as you're hearing it, you feel that the urge to like do a soft little step touch with clicks or like a fist grab wouldn't necessarily be out of place, it's a power ballad. It's the difference between her singing Last Night I Dreamt of Mandalay and then putting drums underneath that turn it into And Rebecca's Ghost, da 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 da. It just undercuts the atmosphere and it makes it sound a little bit more Europop. And it's probably coming across a different way to an audience of a different geographical sensibility. But here in the UK, I think that's how it plays. I should also let you know who the writers are. So Sylvester LeVay and Michael Kunze collaborated on the original German production. Sylvester wrote the score and did the orchestrations, and Michael wrote the book and the lyrics. For this English translation, Christopher Hampton wrote the book and collaborated with Michael Kunze on the lyrics, I believe. They're both credited for the English lyrics. And interestingly enough, these are not the only English lyrics I've heard to these songs. The only other ones I'd heard before performed in English were the song Rebecca and the song She's Invincible, both Mrs. Danvers' songs. But they both definitely had English lyrics that were different to these before, and I actually prefer the ones I originally heard. I first heard She's Invincible because when Rebecca was coming to the Shaftesbury over a decade ago, they had some songs that you could listen to on their website, and I listened to She's Invincible, and those were such great lyrics, I still remember them, which is ridiculous. I haven't been able to listen to that song since. I don't think the recording was ever made available beyond being hosted on that website, but from listening to it maybe a couple of times over 10 years ago, I can still tell you those lyrics. She's invincible, she's unbeatable, she's much too strong to die, she's undefeatable, she's invisible, but I know she can see and hear me, she's watching, she's near me. And I think it's because that rhyme I was obsessed with, and for whatever reason, in these different English lyrics, there's no rhyme at the end there. And that can be very jarring, especially when you're expecting a rhyme, you're waiting for resolution on that last line, and it doesn't come. Similarly, I'm not as fond of the new English lyrics for the title song Rebecca. A lot of the lyrics and a lot of the translation does have the habit of being a little bit on the nose occasionally. That is to say, it's a little obvious. The music, I think, is triumphant and has all of these really brilliant themes like a Les Mis type of score does. And there is some really evocative and beautiful imagery within some of these lyrics. The song where she's singing, "I wish that I could find a way to make my happiness a living thing," I think that's a lovely idea. But then there's a slight clumsiness to Maxim de Winter's big song being, "I may forget the way she looks, but I'll never forget her smile," after there's been so much discussion about everyone remembering her timeless beauty, and moments after he's just fully freaked out at a party because I has come down wearing the same outfit that Rebecca wore the previous year, and it's reminded him of her. Like, if you're forgetting the way she looks, that shouldn't have been an issue in the first place. Methinks you do remember the way she looks, and that's a silly thing to sing in the song. But these are all of my thoughts about the nature of the show itself and the nature of this material. What I'm here to review, as well as all of that, is this particular production. So let me tell you what this production is like at the Charing Cross Theatre. So as soon as this was announced, I knew that this was not going to be comparable to that original production that was planning to come to the West End at the Shaftesbury Theatre over a decade ago, because the Shaftesbury is a much bigger stage, it's a big West End house, and the Charing Cross is a small, sort of an off-West End venue, comparatively much smaller sized stage, much smaller auditorium. For this production, they have spent an awful lot of money renovating a room behind the tech desk, I believe, so that they can house what I think is an 18-piece band for this production, which is astounding and sounds fantastic. I should say before anything else, the mixing of the sound, even at that first preview performance, has always been glorious. It sounds stunning. While I'm here, I will talk about the score. I really ought to have done this in the last section. So this production has been directed by Alejandro Benato, who it seems has an extensive background in opera, and that kind of comes across, especially the way that he utilizes the ensemble as sort of a Greek chorus, which is also a feature of the material. Where I have an issue with that is they seem to only be able to travel as this sort of one gangly group. We have an awful lot of servants, and every time we see the servants or hear from the servants, it's the whole bunch of them who all arrive and sing mean things about the new Mrs. De Winter, or they're all really excited about the costume ball that's going to be happening. But because they're all servants, everyone in that ensemble, when she descends the staircase for the costume ball, there are no party guests. For some reason, we don't have people within the ensemble doubling then as arriving party guests, whether that would have stretched the costume budget because it's a costume party and they need like Phantom Masquerade style costumes for one brief moment on stage. I don't know. But Maxim de Winter makes this whole big scene, he's like, "Go and change, you've embarrassed me, you've ruined the party," and it doesn't really matter because nobody's there, so nobody saw her costume. What's meant to be a bustling social atmosphere at the beginning at Monte Carlo seems a little bit dead because there's nobody else there. They're all waiting to be servants later on in the show. They're used to tremendous effect during the fire sequence, I'll tell you more about that later, but they once again arrive as this unwieldy group when they form this sort of mob in one corner of the courthouse sequence while they're singing their feelings in response to the hearing that's going on. At that point, they sing one of the more egregious lyrics in the show, which is, "The man is not to blame, all corpses who've been drowned look very much the same," something to that effect. That's where this show starts to feel a little less Les Mis and a little more Jekyll and Hyde in terms of its tone. But the fact that they travel as this pack and the way that they are staged and the way that they characterize these individuals with these sort of operatic emotions, they're cackling about their new mistress and they're shocked and reeling at this trial. Unfortunately, it makes the whole thing start to feel a little like amateur theatre. And that's before we start to discuss the set. Now, I was under no illusions that we were going to get a set that in any way resembled the original production, or the production that's currently running in Vienna, with this giant staircase set piece, with this grand window that opens, any of that nonsense. I didn't think that that was going to be happening at the Charing Cross, because it's not going to fit into that theatre. We have a staircase, it's a wooden staircase, and without leaving you too much in suspense, it doesn't set on fire, at least at the performance I saw. I have heard that they may be trying to implement a way to do this, because if you know anything about the show, you know that this is the show where the stairs get set on fire. But at the press night performance, although they found a very atmospheric way to stage that sequence, they didn't light the stairs on fire. Honestly, there are parts of this set they probably should set on fire, because smaller theatre doesn't necessarily have to limit your creativity. I've seen so many brilliant fringe productions with less set than this has that do more with innovative techniques and methods to create an atmosphere that feels real and feels extensive. You feel the limitations of this set, unfortunately, because they try and build these big walls. They try and create these completely closed locations, and that's a challenging thing to do. Essentially, the way that this works, we have white curtains that get drawn across the front of the stage. This allows for scene changes to happen behind. Sometimes we see the scene changes, and other times they have to be concealed, which means we play long scenes in front of these curtains, which is a little jarring. The changes in location are created by these wall pieces that fold onto both sides of the stage and kind of open like a book to reveal different set pieces therein. Now, I don't know if it's because of this that they don't have anything on the walls. My biggest issue is when we go to Mandalay and we reveal this and we go to different rooms of Mandalay, there's never anything on the walls. There's no art on the walls, there's very little furniture to speak of, and the furniture gets referenced at multiple points throughout the show. There's a moment in the second act where I is saying, get rid of everything that was Rebecca's. She suddenly found her confidence and she's like, throw it all away, by which I mean those two plants. Everything must be changed, but don't take the desk and the chair away, because then there will be literally nothing left in this room. When they go into Rebecca's bedroom and Mrs. Danvers is pointing to the portrait of Caroline de Winter, they are now miming this on the fourth wall. There is also windows that open on that fourth wall, and it seems as though there is an awful lot on this invisible fourth wall and very little on the other three that we can actually see. If I was investigating the fire that burned down this estate, I would suspect it might be insurance fraud, because this rich couple didn't have any things. Ultimately, what it reminded me of is when you build a house on The Sims and you spend all of the family's money on that nice, like, antique-y, fancy wallpaper, but then you run out of money and you can't afford the things you want to put on the walls. That's what this set looked like. Now, I did see the first preview. I wasn't really looking at it with a critical eye, and there's a handful of things that they've cut from the show and fixed that I'm not mentioning. I will say, the lighting in between then and the press night performance, they just reduced a lot of it, which I think was a good choice. It makes the whole thing feel a little bit more mysterious, and lighting that whole set and that white curtain really brightly is not doing it any favors. Richard Carson, who plays Maxim de Winter, his entire face went unlit for almost the entirety of his big, passionate Act 2 song where he's singing "I'll Always Remember Her Smile" about how much he despised his late wife. I really would have liked to have been able to see his face more during that number. On balance with the direction, I feel like Alejandro may have been just a little bit out of his depth with this production. You know, it's a challenging show. It has an awful lot behind it to live up to, with its history, with the grandeur and the drama and these gothic elements. It's a lot to contend with. And I don't feel that his interpretation of the piece necessarily has an identity. During the Monte Carlo scenes, they are sitting on tables and we're clearly conjuring the idea of them being on a cliff, and we're doing that kind of theatrical storytelling, but then everything is played in a much more naturalistic way when we get to Mandalay. And I'll mention this again later, but naturalism really is not the friend of this production. It doesn't really work with this tone. That's not to say that there weren't parts of this production that I really enjoyed, so let me tell you what I liked about this version of Rebecca. So from the beginning, we find out that this is going to be a sort of a semi-immersive staging where performers will arrive through the auditorium, and some scenes are even played in the auditorium in between two sections of the stalls. Occasionally performers will go out onto the two very small balconies that they have in this theatre, and I makes her first entrance down the side of the audience and walks up onto the steps in front of these white curtains. I like what they project onto these curtains. I think that could be used more even throughout the show. I don't love them when they're just plain curtains. One very striking visual element that happens during her first song when she starts to mention Rebecca's ghost is we see the shadow of a woman behind the curtain just affecting it with her hand, slowly walking past. Very creepy, very dramatic. I liked that. I liked their arrival to the courthouse being preempted by the two of them sharing a short scene in the middle of the auditorium, but then when you had the ensemble playing reporters and I guess members of the public at that hearing, I felt like rather than being pushed to one side of the stage, they could actually have been amongst the audience, because then it would have felt more like we were all watching the hearing. It positions us to be the audience of that moment as well as the audience of the show. Now, Ron Howell is the choreographer for this production, and there wasn't a huge amount for it. It doesn't call for a huge amount of choreography, but the moments where there were really quite powerful. There's one song in the second act, my goodness, where there's this storm happening and a ship has run aground and the ensemble is singing about flotsam and jetsam and flotsam and jetsam. There's so much energy and vitality and punch to that number that I think is missing in a lot of other parts of the show, because that, I mean, it is a dramatic song and it instigates a lot of the tension that will go on to ferment throughout the second act. But on the face of it, it's not the most consequential number. So for that to be so dynamic in its staging and they're throwing things around, and for us to never really have that same kind of a blaze again is a little disappointing. We get almost as much energy and enthusiasm when Mandalay is on fire and they're singing about it and they're running in the auditorium and people are standing at different positions throughout the theatre and there's a lot of red and orange lighting and there's smoke that they're pumping in. They still weren't in the position where they could set the set on fire, but otherwise they created a good sense of urgency, which is what that moment called for. It felt intense, which is what it needed to do. So the biggest praise has to go to Lauren Jones, who is just wonderful as I. She has this brilliant voice, it's youthful, it's sweet, but there's this confident belt that begins to emerge, especially as we enter the second act. It's such a believable arc. You feel so strongly for her. You really support her as she comes into her own and finds her confidence and faces off against Mrs. Danvers. When she's singing the song Mrs. De Winter is me, some of the choices that she makes helped justify some of the oddities within this material, because Mrs. Danvers, the way she's written, has a habit of singing the same lines repeatedly in the same sections, and so she keeps singing Mrs. De Winter won't agree while I is getting rid of like her favourite ornament, which is a weird concept in and of itself, but it was the 20s, so people had favourite ornaments. But Lauren Jones colours her reaction to those lyrics differently each time. The first time she says, she will, I think you'll find, because Mrs. De Winter is me. But the second time she reacts with this slightly incredulous laugh as she repeats the same response. And it's a great choice that helps the material feel a little bit more genuine in that moment. You so believe her love for Maxim De Winter and her fear and her shyness. It's a brilliant performance from her and probably the best in the show. Cara Lane I also think is formidable as Mrs. Danvers, vocally just supreme and wonderful. The heights that she is singing to. There is power and menace and bite in her vocal performance. Her characterization from the beginning is just perfectly intense, and she's laden with some strange quirks within Mrs. Danvers. I wish the material and the direction afforded her the opportunity to develop a little bit more and to change. She has this one moment where she really snaps towards the end, and how she plays that sort of crystallizing moment and everything thereafter is utterly haunting. I also really enjoy her performance during that same song, Mrs. De Winter is me, as we see her challenged for the first time and we see a real vulnerability in her reaction to all of Rebecca's things being thrown out of the house. Thinking about it now, it is still one of the other odd moments of the show that Mrs. Danvers, when she finds out that Rebecca, who she thought told her everything, had kept this secret from her about her health, that she decides in that moment to sing about how she's been utterly betrayed. I don't know if this is a quirk of the English translation, because immediately afterwards she exacts Rebecca's revenge on Mandalay, and she's still sort of doing this for her, even though she's just acknowledged that Rebecca has betrayed her, and I don't think betrayed is the right reaction anyway. In the face of finding out that the person you thought was your closest friend didn't feel like they could tell you about their negative health news, I think this is an opportunity to reflect on yourself and the kind of friend that you were. Anyway, let's talk about Richard Carson as Maxim de Winter. I enjoy the subtlety and the nuance that he's trying to find in this performance. He's soft-spoken, it's almost a mumble in some parts of the show when he starts to really sing and declare his emotions and pour out this revelation and this confession in the second act. He emerges an awful lot more. Unfortunately, he's just not lit in this moment, but at the beginning of the show, we lose him a little bit, and these sort of sullen, emotionally unavailable period men are very difficult to play. They're very difficult to characterize. I just think there's not, like I said, a lot of room for subtlety in this show. I think the performances that really succeed are the ones that are bigger and melodramatic. I'm not going to mention every member of the cast, but Sarah Harlington is in splendid voice as Maxim's sister Beatrice, and is this wonderful, warm presence in the show. I really enjoy her performance, even if she also doesn't really have anywhere to go with it, beyond playing like sisterly concern. We also have Alex James Ward as Jack Favell, a sort of villainous role that he characterizes very well. He is the surviving first cousin of Rebecca, who was also her lover. He is lingering around Mandalay and conspiring with Mrs. Danvers, who he calls Danny, a nickname obnoxious enough that I too would be driven over the edge and set fire to a mansion. He's a little bit Thénardier-esque. He gets this song towards the end of the show where he's singing "I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine." He's trying to extort Maxim de Winter in exchange for not bringing forwards evidence that he thinks would incriminate him in Rebecca's death. A number he performs really well, this sort of smarmy and slimy attitude that he adopts when he's around I, trying to make her uncomfortable, is brilliant. What I think his performance lacks is subtext. We don't get the sensation that he actually had much of a fondness for Rebecca, because he's just smarmy and slimy in the wake of her death, and he's not quite as committed to her as Mrs. Danvers was. Admittedly, nobody is. But there's a pivotal moment where he comes to believe that at the time of her death, she was pregnant with his child, and she was going to tell him that he was going to be a father. And in all of this, when he's trying to manipulate Maxim and when he's appearing at the hearing, he is claiming that he's upset about the death of his cousin. But I don't know that we actually see that. We see like a sort of a feigned shock when he finds out about the pregnancy that we come to understand wasn't really true. But I think certainly he ought to have a bigger reaction to that. There should be a layer of grief, if he did really care for her, underneath all of the slime. And if he didn't really care for her, then that also needs to be obvious. So that's what I thought about this particular production. I did another video on my channel after seeing the first preview where I sat down with Brendan of the YouTube channel Wait in the Wings, and we talked about his relationship to the show and what his greatest aspirations for this were, and whether there was a future for this potentially in the West End. And I think the material in and of itself sings. I think there are moments where maybe we could find a new English translation for just some of these lyrics. I think that could still be considered a little bit of a work in progress, but certainly the score and the characters and this story, there's no reason it shouldn't be staged. It's not inherently problematic as much as the show seems to be cursed, but this particular production, I don't see this transferring to a West End theatre. I don't see this finding a huge amount of success. Unfortunately, what I think is that this wasn't a fantastic marriage of a director to a venue. This was a director with an operatic scope who clearly wanted to be able to produce something bigger, and there are brilliant directors who have produced great work at theatres like the Charing Cross, like Southwark Playhouse, like Many a Chocolate Factory, where they have done, like I said, more innovative, creative things in order to create a world that fits on that stage. In the meantime, unfortunately, I think Rebecca is always going to struggle against its legend and its history. I think the story within the show can't necessarily live up to the story of the show at this time, but it's still taken this major step. This is a huge milestone in its arc, in its history, that this English language version has had a world premiere, that we're seeing this musical at all in London. That's something I didn't think was going to happen, honestly. But those have been my thoughts about the show. If you have seen this at the Charing Cross Theatre already, let me know what you thought of it in the comments section down below. Or if you've seen another production from around the world, what did you think of that? Thank you so much for watching today's review video. I hope that you have enjoyed. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel for many more reviews coming soon, as well as lots more theatre content. I'm very soon going to be travelling over to New York to go see a bunch of Broadway shows. If that sounds exciting, make sure you're subscribed. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds. I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!